Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness create the biggest miracles. What you're about to hear is a true story that will remind you why trust and compassion still matter in our world. It's about a test that was never meant to be a test, a maid who thought no one was watching, and a moment that changed everything for two people who desperately needed hope. Robert Mitchell had everything money could buy but nothing his heart truly needed. At 62, the successful tech entrepreneur lived alone in his sprawling mansion in Beverly Hills, surrounded by luxury but drowning in loneliness. His wife Sarah had passed away 3 years ago after a long battle with cancer, and their only daughter Emma lived across the country in New York, too busy with her own life to visit more than twice a year. The mansion that once echoed with laughter now felt like a museum of memories. Robert had tried everything to fill the emptiness. He'd donated millions to charity, traveled to exotic destinations, even bought a yacht he never used. But nothing could heal the ache in his chest or bring back the warmth that had once filled these halls. After Sarah's death, Robert had become increasingly suspicious of people's motives. It seemed like everyone who entered his life wanted something from him. His so-called friends only called when they needed money for their ventures. Distant relatives suddenly became interested in family reunions. Even his longtime housekeeper of 15 years had started taking small items, thinking he wouldn't notice. When he finally confronted her, she'd quit on the spot, leaving him feeling more betrayed and alone than ever. For months, Robert had been managing the house himself, but at his age, the daily cleaning and maintenance were becoming overwhelming. The dust was accumulating, the gardens were overgrown, and the once pristine home was beginning to reflect the chaos in his heart. He knew he needed help, but the thought of trusting another stranger in his home filled him with dread. That's when Maria Elena Gonzalez entered his life. Maria was 34 years old, a single mother who had immigrated from Mexico 8 years earlier with dreams of providing a better life for her 7-year-old son Diego. She had been working multiple cleaning jobs to make ends meet, often putting in 16-hour days just to pay for their small apartment in East LA and Diego's medical treatments. Diego had been born with a rare heart condition that required expensive medication and regular doctor visits. Maria's ex-husband had abandoned them when Diego was diagnosed, unable to handle the stress and financial burden. Since then, Maria had been fighting alone, working herself to exhaustion while watching her son struggle with an illness that no child should have to face. When Maria applied for the housekeeping position at Robert's mansion, she was at her breaking point. Diego's condition had worsened, and the doctors were recommending a surgery that would cost more than she could earn in 5 years. She had already sold everything of value she owned, worked every available shift, and even considered taking out dangerous loans from predatory lenders. This job was her last hope for earning enough money to save her son's life. During the interview, Maria sat across from Robert in his mahogany-paneled study, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her resume. She had borrowed a nice dress from her neighbor and spent her last $5 on gas to get there. Her English, though improved over the years, still carried the musical accent of her homeland. "I have references from all my previous employers," she said quietly, her dark eyes meeting his with quiet dignity. "I work very hard and I am honest. I just need a chance to prove myself." Robert studied her application, noting the gaps in employment when she'd had to care for Diego during his hospital stays. He'd already decided not to hire her. She seemed too desperate, too needy, and in his experience, desperate people did desperate things. But something in Maria's demeanor stopped him. Unlike the other applicants who had focused on impressing him with their credentials, Maria spoke honestly about her situation. She didn't try to hide her struggles or make excuses. There was a quiet strength in her vulnerability that reminded him of Sarah, who had faced her illness with the same grace and determination. Against his better judgment, Robert offered Maria the position with a 6-month trial period. The salary was generous enough to cover Diego's medical bills, though Maria didn't know that Robert had researched her situation and intentionally set the wage higher than market rate. For the first few weeks, Robert watched Maria carefully, looking for any sign of dishonesty or ulterior motives. He noticed how she arrived 15 minutes early every day, how she worked methodically through each room, and how she always asked permission before touching anything personal. She never complained about the size of the house or the amount of work, even though cleaning the 15-room mansion was an enormous task for one person. Maria treated every object in the house with respect, from the expensive artwork to the family photos that lined the hallways. Robert often caught her pausing to look at pictures of him and Sarah from happier times, but she never asked questions or commented on his personal life. She simply did her work with quiet efficiency and genuine care. What Robert didn't know was that Maria was fighting her own daily battles. Every morning before work, she would kiss Diego goodbye, not knowing if his condition might worsen while she was away. Her sister Rosa watched him during the day, but Maria lived in constant fear that she would receive a call saying her son had been rushed to the hospital again. The medication was helping, but Diego was getting weaker. The surgery he needed was still months away based on what Maria could afford to save, and she wasn't sure he could wait that long. Some nights, she would sit by his bedside after her long day of work, watching him sleep and praying for a miracle that seemed impossibly far away. 3 months into Maria's employment, Robert's paranoia began to surface again. His late wife's jewelry, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, was kept in a safe in his bedroom. The combination was his and Sarah's wedding anniversary, a date so meaningful to him that he'd never considered changing it. Lately, he'd been wondering if Maria had noticed the safe during her cleaning, if she'd been curious about its contents. The thoughts consumed him. He found himself checking the safe obsessively, counting the jewelry pieces, looking for any sign that someone had been inside. His grief and loneliness had morphed into suspicion and fear, and he began to see threats where none existed. One evening, while Maria was cleaning the kitchen, Robert made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He went to his bedroom and deliberately left the safe wide open, with stacks of cash and Sarah's most precious jewelry clearly visible. His heart pounded as he set up a small hidden camera to record what would happen next. This wasn't just about catching a potential thief. This was about proving to himself that he couldn't trust anyone, that his isolation was justified, that the world was as cold and greedy as his wounded heart believed it to be. The next morning, Robert waited in his study, his laptop open to the camera feed, watching as Maria went about her usual routine. She cleaned the guest rooms first, then moved toward the master bedroom. His hands were sweating as he watched her enter the room where his trap waited. Maria entered the bedroom and immediately noticed the open safe. Her steps slowed, and she approached it cautiously, her eyes widening at the sight of the money and jewelry inside. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, and Robert leaned forward, certain he was about to witness his worst fears confirmed. But what happened next left him speechless. Instead of reaching for the valuables, Maria quickly looked around the room, concern etched on her face. She seemed worried that someone had broken in, that Mr. Mitchell might be in danger. She carefully backed away from the safe without touching anything and hurried out of the room. Robert watched in amazement as Maria searched the house, calling his name softly, checking every room to make sure he was safe. When she couldn't find him, she picked up the house phone and dialed his cell number, something she had never done before. "Mr. Mitchell," she said when he answered, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "I am in your bedroom cleaning and I notice your safe is open. I did not touch anything, but I wanted to make sure you are okay and that everything is safe." Robert was stunned. His test had completely backfired. Instead of revealing greed, it had revealed something far more valuable, genuine concern for his well-being. "I'm fine, Maria," he managed to say. "I must have forgotten to close it last night. Thank you for calling." But Maria's integrity was about to be tested even further. After hanging up, she returned to the bedroom to continue cleaning. As she dusted the nightstand near the safe, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. There, among the jewelry, was a photograph of a young woman who looked remarkably like her own mother. It was Sarah Mitchell, Robert's late wife, in what appeared to be a candid moment of pure joy. Maria had been cleaning around Sarah's photographs for months, but she'd never seen this particular picture. Sarah was laughing in the photo, her eyes bright with life, and she was wearing a simple silver locket that Maria recognized because she cleaned around it every day in the photos downstairs. Something about Sarah's expression in the photo moved Maria deeply. Perhaps it was because she understood the pain of loss, or because she saw something universal in a mother's love, but Maria found herself thinking about the man who must have taken this picture, who kept it hidden away with his most precious treasures. Without really thinking about what she was doing, Maria began to close the safe. She felt uncomfortable leaving Mr. Mitchell's valuables exposed, even though he'd apparently left it open himself. As she started to swing the heavy door shut, a piece of paper fell out and fluttered to the floor. Maria picked it up and saw that it was a letter, written in a woman's handwriting. The top read, "My dearest Robert," and she immediately realized it was private correspondence from his late wife. She started to put it back without reading it, but the first line caught her eye. "If you're reading this after I'm gone, it means you found my secret stash of love letters." Maria's heart clenched. She knew she shouldn't read any further, but something about the vulnerability of the moment, the raw humanity of grief and love, made her understand that this man was suffering in ways she could relate to. She carefully placed the letter back in the safe exactly where it had fallen from, but the brief glimpse had given her insight into Robert's pain. She understood now why he seemed so sad, why the house felt so empty despite its grandeur. He wasn't just a wealthy man living alone, he was a widower drowning in memories and struggling to find meaning after losing his soulmate. As Maria finished cleaning the bedroom, she found herself thinking about Diego and how she would feel if something happened to her. Who would remember their private jokes, their bedtime stories, their dreams for the future? The thought of such loneliness made her heart ache for Mr. Mitchell. That evening, after Maria had gone home, Robert reviewed the camera footage. What he saw changed everything. He watched Maria's genuine concern when she found the safe open. He saw her resist temptation when she could have easily taken anything she wanted. But most importantly, he witnessed something he hadn't expected. He saw her treat his private belongings with the same reverence she would want someone to show her own treasures. When she'd picked up Sarah's letter, Robert had initially felt angry. But as he watched the footage, he saw Maria's face as she realized what she'd found. There was no curiosity or invasion in her expression, only understanding and respect. She'd handled the letter like it was made of glass, placing it back with infinite care. For the first time in years, Robert saw someone treat his grief with dignity. But Maria's test was far from over. The next week, while cleaning Robert's home office, Maria discovered something that would challenge her integrity in an entirely different way. Hidden behind a stack of business papers was a medical bill with Diego's name on it. Her hands shook as she realized what she was looking at. Mr. Mitchell had somehow obtained her son's medical records and had been secretly paying for Diego's treatments. The bills she'd been struggling to cover, the medication she'd been saving every penny to afford, the upcoming surgery she'd been desperately trying to finance, Robert had been covering everything anonymously through the hospital's charity program. Maria sank into the chair beside the desk, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she'd discovered. This man, who barely spoke to her beyond necessary instructions, who she'd assumed saw her as just another employee, had been quietly saving her son's life. The revelation hit her like a tidal wave. All those months she'd been working herself to exhaustion, taking on extra jobs, selling her belongings, and losing sleep over medical bills that were already being paid. All those nights she'd cried herself to sleep worrying about Diego's future. Mr. Mitchell had been ensuring that future was secure. Maria realized she was faced with a choice. She could pretend she'd never seen the documents and continue accepting Robert's secret help. She could quit and try to maintain her pride. Or she could do something that terrified her. She could acknowledge the gift and the vulnerability it represented. That afternoon, instead of leaving immediately after her shift, Maria knocked softly on Robert's study door. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "May I speak with you, please?" Robert looked up from his computer, surprised. In all the months Maria had worked for him, she'd never requested a private conversation. "Of course," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Maria sat down, her hands folded in her lap, struggling to find the words. "I found something today while cleaning your office. I think you dropped some papers." She placed the medical bills on his desk, her eyes filled with tears she was trying hard not to shed. Robert's face flushed. He'd been so careful to keep his charitable activities secret, but somehow he'd let his guard down. He opened his mouth to explain, to justify, to make excuses. But Maria spoke first. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you do this for us?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, looking at this woman who had just given him the chance to deny everything, to protect his privacy, to maintain the emotional distance he'd built around himself. Instead, he found himself telling her the truth. "Because Diego reminds me of my daughter when she was young," he said softly. "Because watching you fight for your son reminds me of how Sarah fought for her life. Because in this big empty house, knowing that somewhere a little boy is getting better because of something I can do makes me feel less alone." Maria wiped her eyes, but the tears kept coming. "All this time, I thought I was fighting alone. I thought no one cared about us. I lost my family," Robert said, his own voice breaking. "Helping yours helped me remember what it felt like to be part of something meaningful again." They sat in silence for several minutes, two people from completely different worlds who had found an unexpected connection through loss, hope, and the simple recognition of shared humanity. But Maria wasn't finished surprising Robert. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, straightening her shoulders. "I cannot accept this charity anymore. But I have a proposal for you." Robert raised his eyebrows, curious. "You have been alone in this big house, and I have been alone raising Diego. You have money but no family nearby, and I have family but struggle with money. What if instead of you helping us from far away, we help each other up close?" She took a deep breath, gathering courage for what she was about to propose. "What if Diego and I moved into the guest house in your backyard? I could take care of the main house properly, be here if you need anything, and Diego could have a safe place to recover from his surgery. We would not be your charity case. We would be your family." Robert was speechless. In all his planning and testing and suspicion, he had never imagined this possibility. The guest house had been empty for years, originally built for Sarah's elderly mother who had passed away before they could use it. The idea of having life and laughter in his backyard again, of having a child's energy brighten his property, was both terrifying and wonderful. "But what about Diego's father, Maria?" he asked gently. "Won't this complicate things?" Maria shook her head. "Diego's father left when he learned about the medical bills. He said he couldn't handle the responsibility. It has been just Diego and me for 3 years now." Robert felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the same protective fury he'd felt when Emma had been hurt as a child. How could any man abandon his sick child? In that moment, Robert realized something profound. He'd been so focused on protecting himself from being used that he'd forgotten the joy of being needed. Maria wasn't offering to use him, she was offering to let him be useful, to let him matter in someone's life again. "I'd like that very much," he said finally. "But only if you'll let me pay for Diego's surgery immediately. Not as charity, but as an advance on your salary. You can work it off over time if that makes you feel better about it." Maria nodded, unable to speak through her tears. 2 weeks later, the guest house was filled with the sounds Robert had been missing for 3 years. Diego's laughter as he played in the backyard, Maria humming Mexican folk songs while she cooked, the gentle chatter of mother and son sharing their day over dinner. Diego's surgery was scheduled for the following month, but his health had already improved dramatically. The stress of financial worry had been lifted from Maria's shoulders, and the security of a stable home had brought peace to both mother and son. Robert found himself looking forward to each day in ways he hadn't since Sarah's death. Diego would wave at him from the garden every morning, and sometimes in the evenings, Maria would bring Robert a plate of homemade tamales or fresh tortillas. The little boy had started calling him Abuelo Robert, and the title filled a hole in Robert's heart he didn't even know existed. 1 month after Maria and Diego moved in, Robert made another discovery that would test his faith in humanity once more. He was cleaning out Sarah's jewelry box, finally ready to donate some pieces to charity, when he found something that stopped him cold. Sarah's most precious necklace, a family heirloom worth over $50,000, was missing. Robert's heart sank. The necklace had been in the safe during his test, and Maria was the only person who had access to his bedroom. Had he been wrong about her? Had his loneliness made him naive? For days, he agonized over what to do. The rational part of his mind told him to check the pawn shops, to confront Maria, to call the police. But his heart couldn't reconcile the woman who had shown such integrity with someone who would steal from him. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty, Robert approached Maria while she was working in the kitchen. "Maria, I need to ask you about something, and I want you to know that whatever the answer is, it won't change Diego's surgery or your job." Maria looked up from the vegetables she was chopping, immediately sensing the seriousness in his tone. "There's a necklace missing from Sarah's jewelry collection. It's a family piece that belonged to her grandmother. I'm not accusing you of anything, but you're the only person who's been in the bedroom since I last saw it." Maria's face went pale, and for a moment Robert's heart broke, thinking his worst fears were confirmed. But then Maria's expression changed to one of understanding, and she smiled through her tears. "Oh, Mr. Robert, I am so sorry. I should have told you right away." She wiped her hands on her apron and gestured for him to follow her. They walked to the guest house, where Diego was napping on the couch, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. Maria led Robert to a small dresser and opened the top drawer. Inside, wrapped carefully in a soft cloth, was Sarah's missing necklace. 3 weeks ago, when Diego had his bad episode and the ambulance came, I was scared he might not come home, she whispered, careful not to wake her son. I found him in your bedroom that morning, where he sometimes likes to look out the big window at the birds. He was holding this necklace, and he told me it made him feel safe because the lady in the picture looked like an angel. Maria's voice broke as she continued. I took it from him because I knew it was not ours to keep, but then he got so sick that I forgot to return it immediately. When he came home from the hospital, he asked for the angel necklace again because it helped him not be scared. I have been meaning to bring it back to you, but I did not know how to explain without getting Diego in trouble. Robert looked down at his sleeping grandson, because that's what Diego had become to him, and felt his heart crack open in the most beautiful way. He's not in trouble, he said softly. Sarah would have wanted him to have it if it brought him comfort. Maria shook her head firmly. That is too generous, Mr. Robert. It is a family treasure. Robert picked up the necklace, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. He thought about Sarah, about the love she'd put into everything she touched, about how much joy she would have felt knowing her jewelry was comforting a sick child instead of sitting unused in a safe. Sarah always said that treasures are only valuable when they're treasured, he said, gently placing the necklace back in Maria's hands. She would be angry with me if I kept this locked away when it could be helping Diego feel brave. Maria tried to protest, but Robert held up his hand. Besides, I've learned something important these past few months. I've been so afraid of people wanting something from me that I forgot how good it feels to give something meaningful away. 1 week later, Diego's surgery was a complete success. Robert sat in the hospital waiting room with Maria, holding her hand as they waited for news from the doctors. When the surgeon emerged with a smile, announcing that the procedure had gone perfectly and that Diego would live a normal, healthy life, both adults broke down in tears of relief and joy. As Diego recovered, the relationship between the three of them deepened into something none of them had expected. Robert began teaching Diego about computers and technology, sharing stories about building his company and encouraging the boy's natural curiosity. Diego taught Robert how to play soccer in the backyard and shared his love of astronomy, pointing out constellations from the mansion's rooftop terrace. Maria watched these interactions with wonder, seeing her son gain the father figure he'd never had and witnessing Robert transform from a lonely, suspicious man into someone who laughed again, who had purpose again, who looked forward to tomorrow. 6 months after that first day when Robert had left his safe open as a trap, he found himself in his bedroom once more, but this time he was packing Sarah's jewelry to give to Maria and Diego. Not all of it, but pieces that Sarah would have loved to see worn and appreciated by people who had brought such joy into Robert's life. As he worked, he reflected on the irony of his original test. He'd been trying to prove that people couldn't be trusted, but instead he'd discovered someone more trustworthy than he'd dared to hope. He'd been looking for evidence of greed, but he'd found a woman who had given him far more than she'd ever taken. The camera that had been meant to catch a thief had instead captured something infinitely more valuable, the moment when two broken families began to heal each other. That evening, Robert called Emma in New York. His daughter was shocked to hear genuine happiness in her father's voice for the first time since her mother's death. "Dad, you sound different," she said. "You sound like yourself again." "I have some people I'd like you to meet," Robert replied, looking out his window at Maria teaching Diego how to plant tomatoes in Sarah's old garden. "They've reminded me what family really means." A year later, the mansion was alive again. Emma had moved back to California, unable to resist the pull of seeing her father happy and wanting to be part of the extended family that had formed around him. Diego called Robert Abuelo and Emma Tia, while Robert and Emma considered Maria and Diego as much family as any blood relation. The guest house had been renovated into a proper home, but the boundaries between the main house and the guest house had dissolved. Dinners were shared, holidays were celebrated together, and the loneliness that had once defined Robert's existence had been replaced by purpose, laughter, and love. Robert never told Maria about the hidden camera test, but he never forgot the lesson it had taught him. Sometimes the very thing you're afraid of losing, your trust, your faith in humanity, your willingness to be vulnerable, is exactly what you need to give away in order to find what you're really looking for. Diego grew up strong and healthy, excelling in school and developing a passion for technology that Robert nurtured with pride. Maria completed her GED and started taking business classes at the local community college, with Robert's encouragement and financial support. Emma found in Maria the mother figure she'd been missing since Sarah's death, and in Diego the little brother she'd always wanted. The hidden camera had been meant to reveal a thief, but instead it had captured the moment when a house became a home again, when strangers became family, and when two people learned that the greatest security doesn't come from walls or safes or suspicion, but from the courage to trust and the wisdom to recognize genuine kindness when it appears. Years later, when Robert would tell this story to friends, he would always end it the same way: "I thought I was testing Maria's character, but she was actually revealing mine. I thought I was protecting my valuables, but she was showing me what was truly valuable." The safe still sits in Robert's bedroom, but it's rarely locked anymore. Not because security doesn't matter, but because the real treasures in that house, the laughter, the love, the sense of belonging, can't be stolen by anyone. They can only be shared, multiplied, and passed on to others who need to remember that kindness still exists in this world. Sometimes the greatest test of character isn't what we do when we think someone is watching, but what we choose to see when we look at another person's heart. Sometimes the richest treasures aren't the ones we guard the most carefully, but the ones we're brave enough to give away. This story reminds us that in a world that can feel cold and disconnected, there are still people like Maria who choose integrity over opportunity, who see beyond their own struggles to care for others, and who understand that the most valuable currency isn't money, but kindness. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it with someone who needs to be reminded that good people still exist. Hit that like button to spread this message of hope, and subscribe to Pure Kindness Stories for more tales that prove humanity's capacity for compassion is alive and well. Sometimes all it takes is one person choosing kindness to change everything, and maybe, just maybe, that person could be you.